I was delivering fresh lavender scones to the outdoor seating area of my cafe when I heard my husband's voice through the partially open window of our home office upstairs. The building housed both our apartment and my business, Rosewood Corner Café, in the heart of Millbrook's historic district. What I heard next would have shattered most women, but while David was probably congratulating himself on his brilliant secret planning, I was calmly calculating how to protect everything I'd built. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. So you're saying if we file on grounds of irreconcilable differences, the whole process could be wrapped up in 6 months? David's voice carried clearly through the floorboards above the cafe's kitchen. My name is Elena Carmichael, and at 41, I had just discovered my husband of 14 years was secretly orchestrating our divorce with Montgomery Associates, the most aggressive family law firm in Millbrook County. But what David didn't know was that I'd been watching, waiting, and preparing for exactly this moment for longer than he could imagine. I set the tray of scones on the counter with steady hands and continued listening. The customer at table 6 was still deciding between the blueberry muffin and the cinnamon roll, completely unaware that her baker's world was imploding 20 feet above her head. "The cafe is the main asset we need to discuss," came another voice, clearly the lawyer. "Since it's located in a building she inherited, but the business was built during the marriage." "Right, so I'm entitled to half the business value, correct?" David interrupted eagerly. "Even though it's her little hobby project?" Hobby project. I almost smiled at that. My little hobby had generated more revenue than his accounting practice for the past 3 years running. But David had always dismissed it as my way of keeping busy. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who balanced books for a living had never bothered to actually examine the books of the business feeding us both. "Well, there are some complications we need to consider," the lawyer continued. "Business. Valuations can be tricky, especially when there's been commingling of assets." "What kind of complications?" David's voice sharpened with concern. I moved closer to the window, pretending to water the herb garden I maintained just outside the office window. Mrs. Patterson from the antique shop next door waved at me through her window, and I waved back with a serene smile that would have impressed a meditation instructor. "Your wife would be entitled to a forensic accounting of business finances," the lawyer explained. "Any personal funds she invested, any business. Profits kept separate from marital assets, loan documents, property deeds. All of that becomes relevant. How confident are you about the financial paper trail?" There was a pause that spoke volumes. David had never paid attention to the meticulous records I kept. He'd never questioned why I insisted on maintaining separate business accounts, why I'd been so careful about documentation, or why I'd always handled the cafe's finances myself. "She's not really the type to fight dirty," David said finally. "Elena's always been more focused on her baking than business strategy. She'll probably just want to keep the cafe and move on. More focused on baking than business strategy." If only he knew that the woman who'd built a thriving cafe from nothing had also been quietly consulting with Whitmore and Sterling, the premier business law firm 2 towns over in Oakenhurst, for the past 4 months. "Even so," the lawyer pressed, "I'd recommend we move quickly. The longer she has to prepare, the more complicated this could become." "Has she shown any signs of suspicion?" "None at all," David replied confidently. "I've been careful. She has no idea we're meeting." I glanced up at the security camera I'd had installed last month, the one David assumed was just for protecting the cafe from break-ins. The tiny device had been recording every conversation in that office for weeks, including 3 previous meetings with this same lawyer. "Excellent. Then here's what I recommend." The lawyer's voice dropped lower, but I caught enough. They were planning to file papers next week while I was supposedly at a baking conference in Riverside. David thought he'd have a 3-day head start to prepare his narrative, contact our shared friends, and position himself as the reasonable party seeking an amicable split. The customer at table 6 finally decided on the cinnamon roll, and I served it with the same warm smile I'd been perfecting for years. "Enjoy, Mrs. Hendricks. Made fresh this morning." As she bit into the roll and closed her eyes in appreciation, I felt a familiar surge of pride. This cafe wasn't just my business. It was my sanctuary, my creation, my proof that I could build something meaningful. And David thought he could waltz in and claim half of it based on the legal technicality of marriage. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Working late tonight, honey. Don't wait up. Love you." I typed back, "Of course, darling. I'll save you some dinner." The meeting upstairs was wrapping up. I heard chairs scraping, papers shuffling, and David's voice thanking the lawyer for his discretion. They scheduled another meeting for Thursday, 2 days before David planned to spring his surprise. As I cleaned the espresso machine and prepared for the afternoon rush, I reflected on the beautiful irony of the situation. David assumed I was naive about business and law because I chose to spend my days creating beautiful pastries instead of chasing profit margins. He mistook my contentment for complacency, my kindness for weakness. What he'd failed to notice was that someone capable of transforming an empty storefront into Millbrook's most beloved gathering place, someone who'd navigated commercial leases, health department regulations, supplier contracts, and staff management, might possess more strategic thinking than he'd given her credit for. Tonight, after David fell asleep believing he held all the cards, I would make a phone call to my lawyer in Oakenhurst. Tomorrow, while David continued his secret planning, I would make some arrangements of my own. The afternoon customers began filtering in, drawn by the aroma of fresh bread and the promise of my famous chocolate croissants. Each familiar face reminded me of what was really at stake here. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about protecting the community I'd built, the dreams I'd realized, and the future I'd carefully crafted. David thought he was orchestrating a surprise attack. What he didn't realize was that his surprise had just become mine. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. The evening crowd at Rosewood Corner was buzzing with their usual Thursday energy. The Millbrook Book Club had claimed their corner table, discussing this month's selection over my signature honey walnut tarts. At the counter, Tom Bradshaw was picking up his daily order of 6 espresso shots, fuel for another late night at his veterinary clinic. These people weren't just customers. They were my community, my chosen family, the foundation of everything I'd built over the past 8 years. David had never understood this. To him, the cafe was simply a business that happened to involve food. He saw profit margins where I saw Mrs. Chen bringing her grandson for hot chocolate every Tuesday after his piano lessons. He calculated overhead costs where I saw the teenage study groups that transformed my evening hours into a sanctuary for overwhelmed high school students. He measured success in quarterly reports, while I measured it in the way people's faces lit up when they walked through my doors. "Elena, honey, you've outdone yourself with these lemon bars," called out Patricia Winters, the mayor's wife, holding up a perfectly golden square dotted with powdered sugar. "My bridge club is going to be so jealous when I tell them where I got these." I smiled and refilled her coffee cup. Secret ingredient is a touch of lavender from the garden. Adds just the right floral note. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been growing more than herbs in that garden. For the past 4 months, I'd been cultivating something far more valuable: legal protection. The transformation had started innocently enough. David began working later hours, claiming his accounting firm was expanding their small business clientele. He'd started dressing differently: newer clothes, expensive cologne, a sudden interest in fitness that included a gym membership I'd never seen him use. Most wives might have suspected an affair, but David's betrayal was different. He wasn't cheating with another woman. He was cheating with the idea of a life without me. The first real warning sign came during Millbrook's Autumn Festival 3 months ago. I'd worked 18-hour days for a week, preparing specialty pastries for the town's biggest event of the year. The cafe's booth had attracted lines around the block, and we'd sold out of everything by noon on Saturday. I was exhausted, but exhilarated, basking in the community's appreciation for something I'd created. David's response? Maybe next year you should consider limiting your participation. The festival is fine, but you're spreading yourself too thin. Too thin. As if feeding half the town and bringing joy to Millbrook's most important celebration was somehow excessive. That night, I'd lain awake wondering when my husband had stopped seeing my success as something to celebrate and started viewing it as something to manage. The second warning came during our anniversary dinner at Chez Laurent in nearby Riverside. We'd driven the 40 minutes in unusual silence, and over our appetizers, David had made what seemed like casual conversation about the cafe's finances. "Business has been good this year," he'd observed, cutting into his duck confit. "Have you thought about what you'd do if you ever wanted to scale back? Maybe sell and do something less demanding?" Less demanding. Like my passion was just an exhausting hobby I'd eventually outgrow. I'd deflected with talk about new menu items and the upcoming holiday season, but that night marked the beginning of my quiet vigilance. Within a week of that dinner, I'd scheduled a consultation with Margaret Whitmore at Whitmore and Sterling. Margaret had handled the legal work when I'd purchased the building next door to expand the cafe's seating area. She was sharp, thorough, and importantly, she understood business law in a way that would prove crucial. "Elena," Margaret had said during our first meeting, "the good news is that you've maintained excellent separation between business and personal finances. Your cafe's assets are clearly delineated from marital property. The building ownership, business accounts, equipment purchases. You've documented everything meticulously. That meticulous documentation wasn't accidental. I'd learned early in my entrepreneurial journey that success required more than great recipes. It demanded careful planning, detailed records, and protective strategies. Skills that David had always dismissed as overthinking. Margaret had also recommended something that seemed paranoid at the time: security cameras. Not just for theft protection, she'd explained, but for comprehensive business security. You never know when you might need visual records of meetings, conversations, or incidents that could affect your business. The camera installation had been my husband's idea, ironically. After a rash of break-ins in the historic district, David had suggested upgrading our security. He'd even helped me choose the system, never realizing that the camera positioned to monitor the shared office space would capture far more than potential burglars. By November, I'd also opened a separate business account at Riverside Community Bank, 40 minutes away, where David's accounting firm had no connections. This wasn't the emergency fund he knew about, which contained exactly what he expected to find, but a comprehensive protection account where I'd begun depositing the cafe's strongest revenue streams. The holiday season had been particularly profitable. My Christmas specialty items, gingerbread villages, custom wedding cakes, and corporate catering orders, had generated revenue that David assumed was going into our shared business account. Some of it was enough to maintain the appearance of normal operations. But the bulk was safely tucked away, along with copies of every contract, receipt, and business correspondence from the past 2 years. Standing now in my bustling cafe, watching the community I'd built enjoy the fruits of my labor, I felt a deep sense of protective determination. These people trusted me to be here, to maintain this sanctuary, to continue creating the small daily joys that made Millbrook feel like home. David saw my work as cute and quaint, Elena's little baking project that kept her busy. What he'd failed to recognize was that cute and quaint had evolved into strategic and substantial. The woman who could coordinate catering for 300 people, manage inventory for a dozen suppliers, and maintain customer loyalty through economic Downturns might possess skills that transferred beyond the kitchen. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Conference call running late. Grabbing dinner with the guys. Home by 10. The guys. Another convenient fiction. I knew from his credit card statements, which I still reviewed since we shared the account, that he'd been having a lot of solo dinners lately. Expensive ones, at restaurants that specialized in impressing potential clients, or in this case, legal consultants. I typed back, "No problem. I'll be working on inventory anyway. Love you." As I hit send, I caught my reflection in the window. 41 years old, hair still thick and auburn with just a few silver threads I'd learned to embrace, laugh lines around my eyes from years of genuine smiles. David had called me still pretty good for my age last month, a comment that had stung more than he'd probably intended, pretty good for my age, as if I were a piece of equipment depreciating in value, rather than a woman who'd built something meaningful with her life. Tomorrow, David would have his Thursday meeting with the lawyer, believing he was moving closer to his secret victory. What he didn't know was that while he'd been planning his exit strategy, I'd been building my defense fortress. The last customer left at 9:30, and I began my closing routine. Counting the register, cleaning the espresso machine, preparing tomorrow's bread dough. Each familiar task felt like an act of defiance now, a declaration that this life I'd created wasn't going anywhere without a fight. As I locked the door and headed upstairs to our apartment, I reflected on the beautiful irony of David's miscalculation. He'd assumed that someone who spent her days nurturing others through food must be soft, unprepared for the harsh realities of legal battles. What he'd forgotten was that running a successful business required the same skills as winning a war. Strategic thinking, resource management, and the ability to anticipate your opponent's next move. And in this particular war, I'd been preparing long before he'd even realized the battle had begun. The first meeting with Margaret Whitmore had taken place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, when David thought I was attending a pastry workshop in Riverside. In reality, I was sitting in the elegant conference room of Whitmore and Sterling, learning about asset protection strategies that would make David's head spin. "Elena, I need you to understand something fundamental," Margaret had said, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the autumn storm raging outside. "In divorce proceedings, preparation isn't just helpful, it's everything. The spouse who documents, protects, and strategizes wins. The spouse who assumes fairness and good faith loses." That conversation had transformed my perspective entirely. I'd always believed that marriage was about partnership and trust, but Margaret's decades of experience had taught her a harder truth. When marriages end, they often end badly. And the person who prepares for the worst, while hoping for the best, protects what matters most. "Tell me about your business structure," Margaret had continued, opening a leather portfolio. "How did you finance the cafe? Who owns what? How have you handled business versus personal expenses?" I'd come prepared with 3 years of meticulously organized financial records, something that had made Margaret raise her eyebrows appreciatively. Most people, she explained, came to her office with shoeboxes full of receipts and vague memories of financial decisions. I handed her color-coded binders with monthly profit and loss statements, copies of every business loan document, receipts for every equipment purchase, and detailed records of every penny I'd invested from my inheritance. "This is exceptional. Documentation," Margaret had murmured, flipping through the pages. "You've maintained perfect separation between business and personal assets. The cafe's revenue, expenses, and growth are completely traceable and attributable to your individual efforts and investments." The relief I'd felt in that moment was profound. All those years of David complaining about my obsessive bookkeeping had actually been my salvation. Every time he'd rolled his eyes at my insistence on keeping detailed records, every time he'd joked about my accountant mentality, despite not being an accountant, I'd been unknowingly building an impenetrable legal fortress. Margaret had then walked me through the realities of business valuation and divorce proceedings. The court will look at several factors, she'd explained. When was the business established? How was it funded? What role did each spouse play in its development? And how have the finances been managed throughout the marriage? In my case, the timeline was crystal clear. I'd purchased the building with money from my grandmother's estate 2 years before David and I were married. I'd spent the first year of our marriage renovating the space, using savings I'd accumulated from my previous job as a sous chef at a high-end restaurant in the state. Capital. The cafe had opened in our second year of marriage, but every loan, every equipment purchase, every business license had been in my name alone. Your husband has never been listed on any business documents? Margaret had asked. Never. He actually insisted I keep the business separate from our personal finances, said it would be cleaner for tax purposes. Margaret had smiled at that irony. David's own insistence on separation, motivated by his desire to avoid any liability for business debts, had inadvertently protected my assets from any future divorce claims. But documentation was only the first layer of protection. Margaret had recommended something that initially felt like paranoia, creating redundant financial security systems. I want you to think about this carefully, she'd said. If your marriage ends badly, what's the first thing a vindictive spouse typically does? I'd known immediately. Empty the joint accounts. Exactly. So we need to ensure that your business operations could continue, even if all shared marital assets disappeared overnight. That week, I'd opened the account at Riverside Community Bank. Not just a simple checking account, but a comprehensive business banking relationship with a line of credit, merchant services, and direct deposit capabilities. I'd also transferred the cafe's most valuable vendor relationships to this new account, ensuring that my supply chain would remain intact regardless of what happened to our joint finances. The transition had been gradual and strategic. Over the course of 2 months, I'd shifted approximately 60% of the cafe's revenue stream to the new account, while maintaining enough activity in the original business account to avoid suspicion. David occasionally glanced at our business statements, but his attention was always focused on the bottom-line totals, not the detailed transaction flows. Margaret had also insisted on something that initially seemed excessive: a private investigator. I don't need evidence of an affair, I'd protested. David's not cheating with another woman. No, but he might be cheating with other financial decisions: hidden accounts, unusual expenses, undisclosed assets or debts. If he's planning a divorce, he might be moving money around or creating liabilities that could affect your settlement. Harrison Blake, the investigator Margaret recommended, had been worth every penny. Within 3 weeks, he'd uncovered David's secret credit card, one he'd opened using his mother's address in Oakenhurst, presumably to hide the statements. The card showed regular charges at upscale restaurants, always for 2 people, but David had been dining alone according to the receipts Harrison obtained. The excess food was takeout, confirming our suspicion that he was meeting with someone regularly. More concerning were the charges for legal consultation fees, financial planning services, and business valuation consultants. David had been preparing, for months, assembling his own team of professionals to maximize his divorce settlement. While I'd been worried about our marriage, he'd been treating it like a business acquisition he was planning to liquidate. The business valuation consultants particularly worried Margaret. If he's getting the cafe appraised, he's planning to claim it as a marital asset. We need our own appraisal, and we need it done by someone who understands the true ownership structure. Helena Vasquez, the forensic accountant Margaret brought in, spent 2 days at the cafe in November, posing as a potential investor interested in franchise opportunities. She'd analyzed every aspect of the operation: foot traffic patterns, profit margins, customer loyalty metrics, growth trajectories, and competitive positioning within the Millbrook market. Her conclusion had been both validating and strategically valuable. This business is worth significantly more than its current book value, she'd told me during our confidential meeting. You've built something with tremendous goodwill, customer loyalty, and growth potential. But more importantly, every element of value creation can be traced directly to your individual efforts, investments, and expertise. Helena had also identified something David's consultants would likely miss. The cafe's value was intrinsically tied to my presence and reputation. Unlike a franchise or corporate business that could operate under new management, Rosewood Corner's success was built on relationships I'd cultivated, recipes I'd developed, and a community trust I'd earned through years of consistent quality and service. If your husband were to somehow gain control of this business, Helena had explained, he'd essentially be purchasing a building and equipment. The intangible assets, customer loyalty, reputation, specialized knowledge, would likely disappear with your departure. This insight had led to Margaret's most strategic recommendation: enhanced documentation of my unique contributions to the business. She'd arranged for video testimonials from long-term customers, written statements from suppliers about our exclusive relationships, and documentation of my specialized training and certifications that directly contributed to the cafe's success. By December, I'd also quietly secured intellectual property protections for my signature recipes, the cafe's unique brand elements, and my customer database. These weren't just business assets anymore. They were legal shields that would protect my ability to continue operating regardless of the divorce outcome. The security camera installation had been the final piece of the puzzle. The system David helped me choose included not just the obvious theft prevention cameras, but also discrete devices that would capture any conversations in the shared office space. Margaret had been very specific about legal requirements. Since it was my business property and the cameras were openly installed with David's knowledge and participation, any recordings would be admissible evidence. The first recorded conversation had been David's initial meeting with the Montgomery Associates lawyer, where he'd casually dismissed my business acumen and predicted I'd just want to keep the cafe and move on without fighting for additional assets. Each subsequent recording had provided more evidence of his strategic planning and his fundamental misunderstanding of the legal and financial realities he was about to face. By the time I overheard yesterday's conversation about filing papers next week, I wasn't just prepared, I was over-prepared. Every asset was protected, every financial stream was secured, every legal vulnerability was addressed, and every strategic advantage was documented. David thought he was orchestrating a surprise attack on an unsuspecting wife. What he'd actually done was walk directly into a trap that had been 6 months in the making. Tonight, while he worked late, preparing for a client presentation, I would make one final preparation: activating the emergency protocols Margaret and I had established. By tomorrow morning, every shared financial account would be protected. Every business asset would be secured, and every legal document would be filed. David's surprise was about to become mine, and unlike his plan, mine was designed to win. Thursday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made Millbrook look like a Christmas card. I was arranging fresh holly and pine branches around the cafe's entrance when David emerged from our apartment, looking particularly pleased with himself. He was wearing his newest suit, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that he'd purchased last month during one of his mysterious shopping trips. "Big day today," he announced, straightening his tie with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Final presentation for the Riverside Manufacturing account. If we land this one, it could change everything for the firm." Smiled and handed him his usual travel mug filled with dark roast. "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of how hard you've been working on this." He leaned down to kiss my cheek, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne, another recent addition to his routine. "You know, Elena, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we talked about your future plans for the cafe." "My future plans?" I kept my voice light, curious rather than defensive. "Well, you've built something really nice here," he said, gesturing. around the cafe with the patronizing air of someone explaining something obvious to a child. But running a business is exhausting. All those early mornings, the weekend work, dealing with difficult customers. Don't you ever want to just relax? Enjoy life? The irony was breathtaking. David was suggesting I abandon my life's work while secretly planning to claim half of it in a divorce settlement. I arranged my expression into one of thoughtful consideration. I suppose I haven't really thought about slowing down, I replied. The cafe keeps me busy, but I love what I do. That's exactly what I mean, David continued, warming to his theme. Love doesn't have to mean sacrifice. There are other ways to be involved in food service without carrying all the responsibility yourself. Franchising, consulting, maybe even selling to someone who could run it while you focus on other things. Other things. Like quietly accepting whatever settlement he decided was fair, presumably. What kind of other things? I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he'd mapped out my post-divorce life. Travel, for instance. You've always talked about wanting to see Italy, study pasta-making techniques. Or you could take some classes, explore new hobbies. You're still young enough to reinvent yourself. Still young enough. At 41. How generous of him to acknowledge that I hadn't completely expired yet. David checked his phone and frowned. I need to get going. This presentation is crucial, and I want to review my notes one more time before the meeting. After he left, I spent the morning serving the regular breakfast crowd and preparing for my own meeting, the one David had no idea was happening. At precisely 10:30, I locked the cafe for my scheduled maintenance break and walked 3 blocks to Millbrook Community Bank, where I had an appointment with Jackson Roberts, the bank manager. What I discovered there would have horrified most wives, but it simply confirmed what I'd already suspected. David had been visiting our joint account regularly over the past month, not to withdraw large amounts, but to study the transaction patterns and account balance trends. Jackson showed me the access logs, which revealed that David had been checking our account balance almost daily, particularly focusing on the cafe's deposit patterns. He seemed very interested in understanding the business cash flow, Jackson explained diplomatically. Asked several questions about automatic transfers, business loan payments, and the relationship between your personal and business accounts. More concerning was David's inquiry about my signature authority on our joint accounts. He'd specifically asked whether withdrawals required both signatures or if either account holder could access the full balance independently. When Jackson confirmed that either of us could withdraw the complete balance, David had seemed remarkably pleased. That afternoon, Margaret called with disturbing news from her contact at Montgomery Associates. David's legal team was moving faster than expected, planning to file divorce papers on Friday rather than the following week. More troubling, they'd scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Tuesday, requesting immediate temporary orders that would freeze all business assets and establish interim financial support. Elena, they're planning to ask the court to appoint a temporary manager for the cafe while the divorce is pending, Margaret explained. The argument will be that the business needs protection from potential vindictive actions by either spouse. The audacity was stunning. David planned to file for divorce, immediately request court protection for our business, and position himself as the responsible party seeking to preserve marital assets while his unstable wife processed the emotional trauma of abandonment. But Margaret's intelligence network had uncovered something even more revealing. David's legal strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of business law and asset protection. His lawyer had apparently assured him that any business developed during a marriage was automatically marital property, regardless of funding, sources, or operational management. They're assuming standard marital asset division, Margaret continued. 50-50 split of everything, with David positioned as the more financially stable spouse who should maintain control during the transition. Period. That evening, David returned home with the triumphant energy of someone who'd just secured a major victory. His presentation, had apparently gone exceptionally well, and he was bubbling with enthusiasm about the firm's bright future. "You know what this means," he said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a glass of wine. "Financial security, real financial security, not just small-town cafe profits." He settled into his favorite chair, looking like a man without a care in the world. "Elena, I think we need to have a serious conversation about our future." Here it was, the moment he'd been building toward for months. I sat across from him, hands folded calmly in my lap, waiting for him to reveal his hand. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he began, adopting the tone of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. "About our marriage, our goals, what we both want from life." "And what have you concluded?" I asked softly. "Well, we've grown in different directions. You're focused on this small-town life, the cafe, the community connections. All wonderful things, but limited in scope. I'm thinking bigger picture now. Regional expansion, maybe even relocating to a larger market where there are more opportunities." Nodded thoughtfully. "More opportunities for what?" "For both of us," he said, though his emphasis suggested he was primarily thinking about himself. "The firm is considering opening a branch office in the state capital. It would mean leaving Millbrook, obviously, but think about the possibilities. You could consult for restaurants there, maybe even open a place in a more sophisticated market." The manipulation was masterful. He was presenting his planned abandonment as an opportunity for us both, a chance to grow beyond the limitations of our current life. What he was actually describing was his fantasy of freedom, divorcing me, claiming half the cafe's value, and starting fresh in a larger city with a substantial financial cushion. "That sounds like a big change," I said carefully. "Would we sell the cafe?" "Well, that's something we'd need to figure out. The business has value, obviously, but it's also tied to this specific location and your personal reputation. We'd need to get it properly evaluated, understand what our options are. Our options are business." David had seamlessly transitioned from dismissing the cafe as my little hobby to claiming it as a shared asset that required his involvement to maximize its value. "Have you thought about what that evaluation might reveal?" I asked, genuinely curious about his assumptions. David's confidence was absolute. "Honestly, probably not as much as we might hope. Small-town businesses have limited resale value, and so much of what you've built is dependent on personal relationships that wouldn't transfer to new ownership. But still, there's the building, the equipment, the established customer base. I'd estimate maybe 200,000, possibly more if we find the right buyer. 200,000. His estimate was less than half of Helena Vasquez's professional valuation, and it completely ignored the intellectual property protections, brand equity, and growth potential that made the cafe genuinely valuable. David was planning to claim half of something he'd never bothered to understand. "Of course," he continued, "any major decisions like that would need to be made carefully, with proper legal guidance. We'd want to make sure everything is handled fairly and professionally. While secretly planning to ambush me with divorce papers and emergency court orders." That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I reviewed the security camera footage from his afternoon meeting. The lawyer had brought additional documents this time, including what appeared to be preliminary asset valuation reports and a timeline for filing procedures. I could hear David's voice clearly, through the recording. "She has no idea any of this is coming. Elena thinks we're just going through a rough patch. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be 3 steps ahead." The lawyer had cautioned about potential complications, but David had waved off every concern. "Trust me, I know my wife. She's not built for legal battles. Elena will want to avoid conflict and settle quickly. She'll take whatever seems reasonable, rather than fight." Not built for legal battles. David had confused kindness with weakness, community focus with naivety, and contentment with complacency. He'd mistaken my willingness to nurture others for inability to protect myself. His final recorded comment was the most revealing. The best part is, she's actually been helping without knowing it. All that obsessive record-keeping she does will make the asset division much simpler. Everything documented, everything organized. It's like she's been preparing for this divorce better than any lawyer could. David thought my meticulous documentation would make his victory easier. What he didn't realize was that those same records would make his defeat absolute. Tomorrow, while he prepared for his surprise attack, I would activate the final phase of my own strategy. By Friday morning, when David planned to ambush me with divorce papers, he would discover that the woman he'd underestimated had been preparing for a very different kind of battle. His confidence was about to become his downfall, and unlike his plan, mine was designed to protect everything that truly mattered. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the cafe windows in delicate patterns that would have seemed beautiful under different circumstances. David left early for what he claimed was a breakfast meeting with potential clients, but I knew better. He was meeting with his lawyer to finalize the divorce papers he planned to serve me with later today. At exactly 8:30, 30 minutes before the cafe officially opened, I made the phone call that would change everything. "Margaret, it's Elena. David just left for his meeting. It's time." "Understood. Are you ready for this?" I looked around my cafe, the warm wood floors I'd refinished myself, the hand-painted murals depicting Millbrook's landmarks, the collection of vintage coffee cups donated by customers over the years. Every corner held memories of the community I'd built, the dreams I'd realized, the life I'd created from nothing. I'm ready. Within minutes, Margaret's carefully orchestrated plan was in motion. The first call went to Jackson Roberts at Millbrook Community Bank. As a joint account holder, I had every legal right to protect our shared assets from potential fraud or misuse. Jackson had been expecting my call since Wednesday, when I'd provided him with copies of the security recordings showing David's meetings with divorce lawyers. "Mrs. Carmichael, given the evidence you've provided of potential financial misconduct, we're implementing immediate protective measures on all joint accounts," Jackson confirmed. "The accounts will be frozen pending legal clarification of asset ownership." The second call went to Harrison Blake, the private investigator, who was positioned outside Montgomery Associates offices. His job was simple: photograph David receiving the divorce papers and his reaction to the first phone call he would receive from the bank. The third call was the most satisfying. Margaret contacted Judge Patricia Hendricks's office to file an emergency motion for protective orders, not for David but for me. Our petition requested immediate protection of business assets based on documented evidence of planned financial misconduct and attempted business appropriation. "Elena, I'm filing your counter-petition at the same time David files his initial papers," Margaret explained. "But here's the beautiful part. Our filing includes 6 months of evidence, professional valuations, and documentation that will stop his emergency orders dead in their tracks." At 9 o'clock, I opened the cafe as usual. Mrs. Chen arrived promptly with her grandson Tommy for their Friday morning hot chocolate tradition. The morning regulars filtered in, unaware that their beloved gathering place was at the center of a legal battle that would be decided within hours. At 9:47, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Then again. On the fourth call, I answered with the calm voice of someone completely unsurprised by whatever emergency might be occurring. "Hello, David. How's your meeting going?" "Elena? What the hell have you done?" His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "The bank just called. They've frozen our accounts. They're saying something about potential fraud investigation." "Fraud investigation? That sounds serious. Are you okay? Should I be worried?" "Don't play games with me. I know you did this. Why would you freeze our accounts?" I paused to serve Mrs. Peterson her usual Friday almond croissant before responding. "David, I'm not sure what you're talking about. I've been here serving customers since 9. Why would I freeze our accounts?" The bank says they received evidence of financial misconduct. What evidence? What did you tell them? Another pause, this time to ring up Tom Bradshaw's morning coffee order. I really can't discuss this over the phone, David. If there's a serious financial issue, maybe we should both contact our lawyers. Our lawyers. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. I could hear his sharp intake of breath through the phone. Your lawyer? Elena, what lawyer? Why do you have a lawyer? David, if someone is investigating our finances for fraud, don't you think I should protect myself? I consulted with someone just to understand my rights. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When David spoke again, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. We need to talk. I'm coming home. Actually, I'll be pretty busy today. The holiday catering orders are keeping me swamped. Maybe this evening? I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Margaret. He just found out about the account freeze. Harrison should have some interesting photos of his reaction. Perfect timing. I'm in Judge Hendrix's office right now. David's lawyer filed his papers 20 minutes ago, requesting emergency asset protection and temporary business management. The judge is reviewing our counter-filing as we speak. At 10:15, David burst through the cafe door looking like a man whose world had just collapsed. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from what had clearly been a frantic drive from Riverside back to Millbrook. Elena, we need to talk. Now. I looked around the bustling cafe filled with customers enjoying their morning treats and conversations. This really isn't the time or place, David. I have a business to run. A business to run? His voice rose dangerously. Our business, Elena. Our shared business that you've apparently decided to weaponize against me. Mrs. Chen looked up from her hot chocolate with concern. Several other customers had stopped their conversations to watch the unfolding drama. David's public outburst was exactly the kind of scene that would damage his carefully constructed image as the reasonable, stable spouse. David, you're making a scene. Perhaps we should discuss this privately later. Privately? Like the way you privately hired lawyers and froze our accounts. He was losing control now, his voice carrying across the cafe. Like the way you privately decided to sabotage our marriage? I maintained my calm demeanor, speaking in the soothing tone I'd perfected for dealing with difficult customers. I think you're upset and not thinking clearly. Why don't you go home and relax? We can talk when you've had a chance to calm down. The suggestion that he needed to calm down, delivered in front of a cafe full of witnesses, was the final straw. David's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. Calm down? You've destroyed everything, Elena. Everything we've built together, everything we've planned. And you want me to calm down? David, I said quietly, I think you should leave now. You're disturbing my customers. He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. The woman he'd planned to blindside with divorce papers was calmly asking him to leave her business because he was causing a disturbance. The power dynamic he'd assumed was already shifting visibly. At 11:30, Margaret called with the first major victory. Judge Hendrix denied David's emergency motions completely. The request for temporary business management was dismissed, the asset freeze request was denied, and the court has ordered a full investigation into the financial misconduct allegations we documented. What does that mean practically? It means David's strategy has backfired spectacularly. Instead of gaining control of your assets, he's now under court investigation for attempted fraud. The judge was particularly interested in the recordings of him discussing plans to empty joint accounts and claim business assets he never owned. The afternoon brought a series of increasingly desperate phone calls from David. Each voicemail revealed his growing understanding of how completely his plan had failed. Elena, we need to work this out. I never meant for things to get this complicated. Please, call me back. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions. I'm willing to discuss a reasonable settlement. We don't need to let lawyers tear apart everything we've built. By evening, David's tone had shifted from anger to panic to something approaching desperation. His final message of the day contained an admission that would prove crucial in later proceedings. Look, maybe I moved too fast with the legal stuff. Maybe I should have talked to you first about the business valuation and asset division. But, Elena, you have to understand. I was just trying to protect both of us financially. We can fix this. Asset division, business valuation, protecting us financially. In his panic, David had inadvertently confessed to exactly the premeditated planning that would destroy his case. That evening, as I closed the cafe and prepared for what would likely be several difficult days ahead, I reflected on the beautiful precision of the day's events. David had spent months planning a surprise attack, carefully positioning himself for maximum advantage, confident that his unsuspecting wife would crumble under pressure. Instead, he'd walked into a trap 6 months in the making. Every move he'd planned had been anticipated and countered. Every assumption he'd made about my capabilities had been proven wrong. Every advantage he'd thought he possessed had evaporated within hours. Margaret called one final time as I locked the cafe's front door. Elena, I've seen a lot of divorce cases over the years, but I've never seen someone so thoroughly outmaneuvered, so quickly. David's legal team is requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. They want to discuss settlement options. Settlement options? They're going to try to minimize the damage. David is realizing that his planned victory has become a complete disaster, and now he's looking for any way to avoid total defeat. As I climbed the stairs to the apartment I would likely have to myself for the foreseeable future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The worst was over. David's surprise was complete. His overconfidence had been shattered, and his assumptions about my character had been proven devastatingly wrong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I could rest knowing that everything I'd built was protected, everything I valued was secure, and everything David had planned had crumbled into dust. The hunter had become the hunted, and the woman he'd underestimated was about to show him exactly what strategic thinking really looked like. Saturday morning brought the first wave of consequences that would reshape David's life in ways he'd never anticipated. I was preparing the weekend's special, maple pecan Danish with my grandmother's secret glaze, when Margaret called with news that made me pause mid-stir. Elena, David's emergency meeting didn't go well. Montgomery Associates has withdrawn from representing him. I set down my whisk and stepped into the quiet of the cafe's back office. They dropped him as a client? Apparently, when the firm reviewed the evidence we provided to the court, especially those security recordings, they realized David had been less than truthful about several key facts. No reputable law firm wants to be associated with a case built on lies and potential fraud charges. The implications were staggering. David wasn't just losing his legal representation, he was being publicly abandoned by the law firm he'd trusted with his secret strategy. In a legal community as small as Millbrook County, that kind of rejection would spread quickly. There's more, Margaret continued. Harrison Blake called this morning. David spent yesterday afternoon driving to 3 different law firms in Riverside, trying to find new representation. 2 turned him down after reviewing his case file. The 3rd demanded a $50,000 retainer up front. $50,000. David's share of our joint savings, which was now frozen pending court review, had been approximately $30,000. His secret credit card was already maxed out from months of legal consultations and expensive dinners. He was discovering that divorce proceedings weren't just emotionally devastating, they were financially crushing when you hadn't planned for the actual costs. The morning rush brought its usual crowd of weekend regulars, but today, their conversations carried an undercurrent of speculation about yesterday's dramatic scene. Millbrook was a small town where news traveled faster than morning coffee, and David's public outburst had already become the weekend's primary gossip topic. "Elena, dear, is everything all right?" Mrs. Patterson from the antique shop asked quietly, as I served her usual Saturday scone. Harold and I couldn't help but notice David seemed upset yesterday. I maintained my practiced smile while arranging fresh flowers in the window display. Just some business stress, Mrs. Patterson. Nothing. That can't be worked out. But the truth was more complicated. Through the grapevine of interconnected Millbrook relationships, I was learning just how extensively David's behavior had damaged his reputation over the past few months. What I'd interpreted as his growing distance from our community, others, had noticed as arrogance and dismissiveness. Tom Bradshaw, the veterinarian, pulled me aside during the late morning lull. Elena, I probably should have mentioned this sooner, but David approached me last month about potentially selling the cafe. Said you were thinking about getting out of the restaurant business. My hands stilled on the espresso machine I was cleaning. He said, "What?" He wanted to know if I knew any investors who might be interested in purchasing an established food service business. When I asked if you were planning to relocate, he got vague about your future plans. Tom's expression was troubled. I assumed you two had discussed it, but yesterday's incident made me wonder if I'd misunderstood the situation. David had been shopping around my business without my knowledge, testing the market for potential buyers while secretly planning our divorce. The level of betrayal was breathtaking, but it also provided crucial evidence of his premeditated deception. The afternoon brought even more troubling revelations. Susan Matthews, who managed the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce, stopped by with information that made my blood run cold. Elena, I received the strangest call from David yesterday. He wanted to know about the process for transferring business memberships and community organization leadership roles. Specifically, he asked whether business affiliations automatically transferred to surviving spouses in case of incapacitation. Incapacitation. David had been researching what would happen to my business relationships if I were somehow unable to manage them myself. Combined with his request for temporary business management during the divorce, a disturbing pattern was emerging. He also asked about the cafe's participation in next year's autumn festival, Susan continued. Wanted to know if vendor contracts could be modified or reassigned. I told him those decisions were entirely up to you, but he seemed very interested in the financial details of our vendor agreements. David hadn't just been planning to divorce me and claim half my assets. He'd been systematically researching how to assume control of my business relationships and community connections. His vision of our divorce apparently included him stepping into my role as owner and operator of Rosewood Corner Café. The weekend's most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. Barbara Hendricks, Judge Patricia Hendricks' daughter, and a regular customer, mentioned something that stopped me mid-conversation. Elena, my mother asked me to tell you that she reviewed your case files last night. She's rarely seen such comprehensive documentation in a family law proceeding. Barbara lowered her voice conspiratorially. She also said that if the allegations against David are proven, it could affect more than just your divorce. What do you mean? Well, Mom can't discuss active cases, but she mentioned that financial fraud and deliberate deception in divorce proceedings sometimes trigger investigations by other agencies, tax authorities, professional licensing boards, that sort of thing. Professional licensing boards. David's accounting practice depended on maintaining professional certifications and ethical standards. If the court's investigation revealed deliberate financial manipulation and fraud, his career could be in jeopardy along with our marriage. Sunday brought the weekend's final devastating blow to David's situation. I was closing the cafe early to attend evening service at Millbrook Community Church when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Carmichael, this is Patricia Thornton from Riverside Accounting Associates. I'm calling because we need to discuss David's employment status. Riverside Accounting Associates, David's firm. The prestigious partnership he'd been working toward for 3 years. The career advancement that had supposedly motivated his recent late nights and weekend work. There have been some irregularities discovered in David's handling of client. Accounts, Patricia continued diplomatically. Nothing criminal, but professional conduct issues that require investigation. Given the current legal proceedings and the allegations that have come to our attention, the firm feels it's best if David takes a leave of absence while everything is resolved. A leave of absence. David was being suspended from his job while the firm investigated whether his personal legal troubles reflected broader professional misconduct. In the accounting world, even the appearance of financial impropriety could be career-ending. That evening, as I sat in church listening to Pastor Williams deliver a sermon about the consequences of deception, I reflected on how quickly David's carefully planned advantage had transformed into complete disaster. Within 48 hours, he'd lost his legal representation, damaged his community reputation, faced potential criminal investigation, and jeopardized his professional career. The most telling moment came when I returned to the apartment Sunday evening to find David sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. He looked up as I entered, and for the first time in months, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Elena, we need to talk. I think we've said enough for one weekend, don't you? Please. I know I've made mistakes, but this has gotten completely out of hand. I never intended for things to go this far." I hung up my coat and started preparing tea, a ritual that had once represented peaceful domestic comfort, but now felt like a strategic delay tactic. "How far did you intend for things to go, David?" I thought we could handle this amicably, divide things fairly and move forward without all this legal drama. Amicably. Fairly. Without legal drama. He was rewriting history in real time, pretending that his months of secret planning and attempted financial manipulation had been motivated by reasonable concern for our mutual welfare. "David, I think you should contact a lawyer tomorrow. You're going to need professional representation for what's coming." "What's coming? Elena, what exactly are you planning?" I looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who'd shared my life for 14 years, who'd helped me hang Christmas lights and celebrated cafe anniversaries, who'd somehow transformed into a stranger willing to destroy everything we'd built together for his own advantage. "I'm not planning anything, David. I'm just protecting what's mine. You're the one who started this war." As I headed toward the bedroom, David called after me with the desperation of someone finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Elena, please. Can't we find a way to work this out? I'll withdraw the divorce papers. We can go to counseling. Start over." I paused at the bedroom door. "The time for working things out was before you secretly met with lawyers, before you tried to sell my business, before you planned to empty our accounts and leave me with nothing. You made your choice, David. Now you get to live with the consequences." Behind me, I heard him slump back into his chair with the heavy sound of a man realizing that his brilliant strategy had become his complete undoing. Tomorrow would bring new developments. But tonight David was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd planned to destroy had been more than capable of protecting herself. The hunter had not only become the hunted, he was discovering that his prey had been a predator all along. Tuesday morning's emergency court hearing arrived with the kind of bitter December wind that cut through winter coats and reminded everyone why most people preferred to stay indoors. But the Millbrook County Courthouse was packed despite the weather, filled with an unusual mix of legal professionals, community members, and what appeared to be several journalists from regional newspapers. I sat beside Margaret in the front row, wearing my best navy suit and the pearl necklace my grandmother had left me, armor appropriate for what would either be my vindication or David's final attempt to salvage his crumbling strategy. Across the aisle, David sat alone at the defendant's table, having finally secured representation from Bradley Morrison, a lawyer from the state capitol whose reputation was built more on aggressive tactics than ethical standards. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her expression suggesting she'd reviewed our case files thoroughly over the weekend. The packed courtroom fell silent as she settled behind the bench and surveyed the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human deception. "This is highly irregular," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Emergency divorce proceedings are typically private affairs involving asset protection and temporary custody arrangements. What we have before us today is something entirely different." Margaret stood smoothly. "Your Honor, the evidence we've submitted demonstrates that this case involves documented fraud, systematic deception, and attempted theft of business assets. The emergency nature of our filing was necessary to prevent ongoing financial crimes." Bradley Morrison shot to his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Those are inflammatory accusations without foundation. My client has done nothing more than seek legal counsel regarding a failing marriage, which is his constitutional right." Judge Hendricks fixed Morrison with a stare that could have frozen the courthouse's heating system. "Mr. Morrison, I've spent my weekend reviewing 6 months of documented evidence, including audio recordings, financial records, and witness statements. Your client's actions go far beyond seeking counsel." She gestured to the court clerk, who began distributing copies of what appeared to be a comprehensive timeline. "Let's review the facts systematically, shall we?" What followed was the most thorough destruction of a legal argument I'd ever witnessed. Judge Hendricks methodically presented the evidence Margaret and I had compiled, each piece more damaging than the last. On October 15th, the defendant consulted with divorce attorneys, while telling his wife he was attending a business conference. On October 22nd, he visited their joint bank accounts to study transaction patterns and withdrawal procedures. On November 3rd, he contacted local business leaders inquiring about selling his wife's cafe without her knowledge or consent. David's face grew progressively paler as the timeline continued. Morrison kept attempting objections, but each one was overruled with evidence that made David's premeditation undeniable. On November 18th, the defendant researched legal procedures for assuming control of business operations in cases of owner incapacitation. On December 1st, he met with Montgomery Associates to plan serving divorce papers while his wife attended a conference, giving him a 3-day advantage to control the narrative. The courtroom's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the full scope of David's deception became clear. I noticed several people in the gallery taking notes, likely the journalists who'd somehow learned about today's proceedings. "Most concerning," Judge Hendricks continued, "are the recorded conversations where the defendant explicitly discussed plans to empty joint accounts, claim ownership of business assets he'd never invested in, and manipulate court proceedings to his advantage." She nodded to the court clerk, who activated an audio system. David's voice filled the courtroom with crystal clarity. "She has no idea any of this is coming. Elena thinks we're just going through a rough patch. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be 3 steps ahead." The impact was devastating. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly, and I saw David slump in his chair as his own words condemned him publicly. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. "Mr. Morrison, your client's actions constitute what I can only describe as a systematic campaign of financial fraud and domestic manipulation. The evidence suggests he planned to divorce his wife, steal her business assets, empty their joint accounts, and position himself as the reasonable party seeking fair resolution." Morrison attempted one final defense. "Your Honor, my client may have been overly strategic in his approach, but planning for divorce isn't illegal. Consulting with attorneys, understanding financial options, preparing for potential outcomes, these are reasonable actions for someone contemplating ending their marriage." Overly strategic? Judge Hendricks' voice could have cut glass. "Mr. Morrison, your client attempted to sell his wife's business without her knowledge, researched ways to assume control of her professional relationships, and explicitly planned to empty their bank accounts while she was out of town. That's not strategy. That's fraud. She turned her attention to Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore, what relief is your client seeking? Margaret stood with the confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. Your Honor, Mrs. Carmichael seeks complete protection of her separate business assets, full documentation of any marital property for equitable division, and restitution for all costs incurred defending against this attempted fraud. And regarding the business? The cafe is entirely Mrs. Carmichael's separate property. She inherited the building, funded all improvements, obtained all licenses and permits, and maintained complete operational control throughout the marriage. Mr. Carmichael has no legal claim to any portion of the business. Morrison jumped up desperately. Your Honor, the business grew during the marriage. Marital labor contributed to its value. My client has rights to community property developed. During their union, Judge Hendricks consulted the forensic accounting report Helena Vasquez had prepared. Mr. Morrison, the court-appointed business evaluator found no evidence that your client contributed labor, capital, or expertise to the cafe's development. His role was limited to occasionally consuming the products. A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom at this clinical description of David's contribution to my business success. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Carmichael maintained complete separation of business and personal finances, documented every investment and expense, and can trace every dollar of business value to her individual efforts and inherited assets. Morrison's final attempt was pure desperation. Your Honor, surely the court recognizes that marriage involves mutual support and contribution that goes beyond financial documentation. My client provided emotional support, household management, and marital partnership that enabled his wife's business success. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the courthouse's old heating system clicking in the background. Judge Hendricks stared at Morrison for what felt like an eternity before responding. Mr. Morrison, are you seriously arguing that your client's emotional support entitles him to ownership of a business he tried to sell without his wife's knowledge? That his household management justifies planning to empty their bank accounts? That his marital partnership included secretly meeting with lawyers to steal her assets? Morrison sat down without answering. Judge Hendricks turned her attention to David directly. Mr. Carmichael, do you have anything to say before I issue my ruling? David stood shakily, looking nothing like the confident man who'd planned this entire scenario. His voice was barely audible when he finally spoke. Your Honor, I never meant for things to go this far. I thought Elena would be reasonable about dividing our assets. I didn't realize she'd been preparing to protect herself from fraud, preparing to defend assets she'd built with her own labor, preparing to prevent you from stealing her life's work. Judge Hendricks's voice was ice cold. Mr. Carmichael, the only thing more disturbing than your actions is your apparent belief that they were justified. She shuffled her papers with the finality of someone rendering judgment. The court finds that the defendant engaged in systematic fraud, domestic financial abuse, and attempted theft of separate property assets. All emergency motions filed by the defendant are denied. All protective measures requested by the plaintiff are granted. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution and to the State Board of Accountancy for professional ethics review. Mr. Carmichael, your actions have consequences beyond this divorce proceeding. As the gavel fell, I felt a profound sense of vindication wash over me. The woman David had planned to surprise and overpower had just watched him be publicly exposed, professionally destroyed, and legally defeated in the most comprehensive way possible. Margaret leaned over and whispered, Elena, I've been practicing family law for 25 years. I've never seen someone so thoroughly outmaneuvered their opponent. Across the aisle, David sat motionless while Morrison packed his briefcase with the efficient movements of someone eager to distance himself from a lost cause. The journalists were already heading for the exits, likely rushing to file stories about Millbrook's most dramatic divorce proceeding in decades. As I stood to leave, I caught David's eye one final time. The man who'd planned to ambush me with divorce papers and steal my business looked broken, defeated, and utterly bewildered by how completely his strategy had backfired. The hunter hadn't just become the hunted, he'd been systematically trapped, publicly exposed and decisively destroyed by the woman he'd foolishly underestimated. Justice, it turned out, was every bit as satisfying as I'd hoped it would be. 1 year later, I stood in the grand opening ceremony of Rosewood Corner's second location in downtown Riverside, watching Mayor Christina Walsh cut the ceremonial ribbon while local news cameras captured the moment. The expansion I'd dreamed about for years had finally become reality, funded by the settlement money David had been forced to pay for his attempted fraud, and the cafe's remarkable growth following the very public vindication of my business acumen. "Elena, this is absolutely beautiful," Mayor Walsh said, gesturing around the elegant new space with its exposed brick walls, vintage chandeliers, and the same warm atmosphere that had made the original cafe Millbrook's beloved gathering place. "Riverside is lucky to have you." The irony wasn't lost on me. David had once suggested I consider relocating to a more sophisticated market, like Riverside, presumably after he'd claimed half my business value. Instead, I'd expanded here on my own terms, with my own capital, carrying the full value of everything I'd built. The past 12 months had brought transformations I could never have anticipated when I first overheard David's secret meeting with his lawyer. The criminal investigation that Judge Hendricks had ordered resulted in David being charged with attempted financial fraud and domestic abuse, charges that were ultimately reduced to financial misconduct in exchange for full restitution and community service. His accounting license was suspended for 2 years, effectively ending his career in Millbrook County. Margaret had warned me that the media attention surrounding our case might be overwhelming, but the reality had been surprisingly positive. 3 major business magazines had featured my story, not as a divorce scandal, but as an example of small business resilience and strategic asset protection. Young entrepreneurs contacted me regularly for advice about maintaining financial independence and protecting their interests in business partnerships. "The key lesson isn't about divorce," I'd told a women's business conference in the state capitol last spring. "It's about never apologizing for being thorough, never dismissing your instincts as paranoia, and never allowing anyone to diminish your achievements as cute or lucky." That conference had led to consulting opportunities with other small business owners, particularly women who wanted to ensure their enterprises were properly protected. What had started as defensive legal maneuvering had evolved into a secondary career, helping others avoid the pitfalls I'd navigated. David's situation had deteriorated steadily throughout the year. After losing his professional license, he'd moved to the state capitol seeking work with firms that might overlook his legal troubles. The last I'd heard through Millbrook's reliable gossip network, he was working as a bookkeeper for a small tax preparation service, earning a fraction of his previous salary and living in a studio apartment near the industrial district. His family had initially rallied around him, convinced that the media coverage had been exaggerated and that surely the courts had been unfair to their son and brother. But as the full details of his deception emerged during the criminal proceedings, even their support had evaporated. His mother, Patricia Carmichael, had actually called me in the spring to apologize. "Elena, I raised David to be better than this," she'd said, her voice heavy with shame. "The way he treated you, the things he planned to do, I can't understand how he became someone capable of such cruelty." I'd listened politely but hadn't offered forgiveness or comfort. Patricia's disappointment in her son's character was genuine, but it didn't erase the months of stress and betrayal I'd endured while David systematically planned to destroy everything I'd built. The cafe's success had exceeded even my optimistic projections. The publicity surrounding the case had initially brought curiosity seekers, but the quality of our food and the warmth of our atmosphere had converted them into loyal customers. Our catering business had expanded to serve corporate events throughout 3 counties, and the online store I'd launched now shipped my signature spice blends and baking mixes nationwide. More importantly, the community support that had sustained me during the darkest months had evolved into genuine business partnerships. Tom Bradshaw had invested in the Riverside expansion, bringing his veterinary clients to our new location. Susan Matthews had helped secure favorable lease terms and city permits. Even Mrs. Chen had contributed by connecting me with her nephew's restaurant supply company, reducing our costs while improving our product quality. Standing now in the Riverside location, surrounded by friends and supporters who'd believed in my vision when my own husband had tried to steal it, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because my life was perfect, divorce and business expansion both carried ongoing challenges, but because I'd proven to myself that I was capable of protecting what mattered most. Harrison Blake, the private investigator who'd helped document David's deception, had become an unexpected friend over the past year. His security consulting business had grown substantially after word spread about his meticulous work on my case, and he'd helped me implement comprehensive protection measures for both cafe locations. Elena, you realize you're something of a legend in investigative circles, he'd told me during last month's security review. I've never worked a case where the client was so far ahead of the threat. Most people call us after they've been victimized. You called us while you were still 3 steps ahead of the person trying to victimize you. That distinction had become central to my new consulting work, teaching other business owners to recognize early warning signs, document suspicious behavior, and protect their assets before crisis struck. The defensive strategies that had saved my business were now helping others avoid similar betrayals. Margaret Whitmore had also benefited from our successful case. Her practice had grown significantly as word spread about her strategic approach to asset protection, and she'd begun specializing in business owner divorce cases. We'd maintained both a professional relationship and a genuine friendship, united by our shared satisfaction in having outmaneuvered someone who'd assumed we were less capable than we actually were. You know, Elena, Margaret had said during our quarterly legal review, I've been thinking about what made David's failure so complete. It wasn't just that he underestimated your capabilities, it was that he never bothered to understand what he was trying to steal. She was right. David had seen the cafe's financial success but missed its real value: the community relationships, the specialized knowledge, the brand loyalty, and the operational systems that couldn't be transferred to new ownership. He'd planned to claim half of something he'd never comprehended, like trying to steal half of someone's personality. The evening's celebration was winding down as the last customers left, and my staff began the familiar closing routine that had become so much more satisfying since I knew it was entirely mine to enjoy. No hidden agendas, no secret resentments, no one plotting to claim credit for work they'd never done. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Chen, Tom's daughter, who'd just started college on a scholarship partly funded by the cafe's community outreach program. Saw the news coverage of the grand opening. So proud to be part of the Rosewood family. Can't wait to come home for Thanksgiving and try the new Riverside location. These were the relationships that mattered, the connections, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's success. David had dismissed them as small-town limitations, but they'd proven to be the foundation of everything meaningful in my life. As I locked the doors of the new location and prepared for the 40-minute drive back to Millbrook, I reflected on the profound transformation the past year had brought. David's betrayal had initially seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me. Instead, it had forced me to discover strengths I'd never fully appreciated and to build protections that had made me stronger than I'd ever been. The woman who'd calmly served customers while overhearing her husband's plans to destroy her life had evolved into someone who could expand her business, mentor other entrepreneurs, and sleep peacefully knowing that everything she'd built was secure. David's cruelest text message would have read very differently if he could see me now. Your husband's betrayal has made you unstoppable, his shock when he realizes you're thriving beyond his wildest imagination. Success, I'd learned, wasn't just the best revenge, it was the most enduring form of justice. And unlike David's short-sighted planning, mine was designed to last a lifetime. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.